Some vacation spots fall out of favor because of bad luck, changing tastes, or a bigger, shinier competitor showing up down the road. Others fall out of favor because they were, quite simply, filthy, and everybody eventually noticed. Sticky floors, brown water, sidewalks nobody wanted to look down at too closely. These are the destinations that didn't just lose their shine, they earned every bit of the reputation that followed them out the door. So today, we're counting down 12 dirty vacation spots in America that deserved their downfall. Number 12. Fisherman's Wharf, San Francisco. Roughly 12 million people cram into Fisherman's Wharf every year, close to 33,000 a day, and the neighborhood shows every bit of that wear. For 2 years running, a travel eSIM company's review analysis found Fisherman's Wharf had more mentions of the phrase tourist trap attached to it than any other attraction on the planet, ahead of Temple Bar in Dublin and Las Ramblas in Barcelona. The complaints aren't limited to overpriced seafood, though there's plenty of that too. Public restrooms get flagged repeatedly as filthy, sidewalks stay crowded with trash from the sheer volume of foot traffic, and one native San Franciscan bluntly told a local news outlet the area is overcrowded with tourists, tacky souvenirs, and overpriced food that isn't good, before calling the whole experience a hellscape. The sea lions at Pier 39 remain genuinely charming. Everything built up around them to catch the overflow crowd has aged considerably less gracefully. Once the actual working heart of San Francisco's fishing industry in the early 1900s, the wharf has spent the last several decades trading almost entirely on nostalgia rather than substance, and tourists picking up on that gap tend to leave unimpressed. Online reviews consistently describe seafood that tastes frozen and reheated rather than fresh off a boat, despite the neighborhood's entire identity being built around fishing. Local business owners have periodically pushed back against the reputation, insisting the criticism doesn't reflect the neighborhood's genuine offerings, but the sheer volume and consistency of complaints, year after year, across multiple review platforms, suggests the grime isn't just a rumor a few disgruntled tourists started online. Panhandling and public restroom complaints show up in nearly every negative review of the area too, a combination that, fairly or not, has become almost as synonymous with Fisherman's Wharf as the sea lions themselves. Number 11. Coney Island, Brooklyn. Coney Island spent the first half of the 20th century as the undisputed king of American amusement, a nickel subway ride away from Manhattan and packed with rides, boardwalk food, and crowds numbering in the hundreds of thousands on a good summer day. Then came the 1960s and 70s, and Coney Island earned a very different kind of reputation. A failed urban renewal push in the late 1960s collapsed when federal funding dried up, leaving the neighborhood, in the words of a 1975 New York Times report, resembling an actual war zone, dotted with demolished buildings and vacant, rubble-filled lots. Steeplechase Park, the last of the major original amusement parks, closed for good in 1964 after crime, gang violence, and a deteriorating, filthy subway station drove attendance into the ground. According to historical accounts of the closure, arson became routine. The famous boardwalk and beach fell into visible disrepair, right alongside everything else. It took local community groups organizing through the mid-1970s, plus decades of slow reinvestment afterward, before Coney Island clawed its way back to anything resembling its former self. Much of the underlying decay traced back to redlining policies dating to 1938. Which made it nearly impossible for property owners in the neighborhood to secure mortgages or insurance, opening the door for slumlords and arsonists to take over buildings that legitimate owners could no longer afford to maintain. Photographer Charles Denson, who grew up in Coney Island's West End and documented the neighborhood extensively during this stretch, later described growing up to the sound of sirens and fires as a near-nightly occurrence. It wasn't until the formation of a grassroots group called Astella Development Corporation in 1975 that the West End's abandoned, rubble-strewn lots finally started filling back in with affordable housing, laying the groundwork for the recovery that eventually followed decades later. Number 10. Times Square, New York City. Ask anyone who lived through New York in the 1970s and 80s about Times Square, and you'll get a very different answer than what a modern tourist would describe. Long before it became a billboard-lit, family-friendly retail hub, this stretch of 42nd Street earned the nickname The Deuce, home to sticky-floored porn theaters, peep shows, drug deals happening openly in balcony seats, and a level of street crime bad enough that police reportedly patrolled in groups of 3 or 4 just for their own safety, Rolling Stone called it the sleaziest block in America in 1981, and it's hard to argue given the era's own coverage. A Times reporter at the time described venerable old movie palaces being allowed to slowly rot away, showing scratchy prints of cheesy second-run films or pornography, which any casual visitor might have thought was the city's leading industry. The turnaround, which finally took hold under Mayor Rudy Giuliani's quality of life crackdown starting in the mid-1990s, involved aggressive zoning changes that pushed adult businesses out entirely and replaced them with the glowing corporate landscape tourists know today. Say what you want about the new Times Square being overcrowded and overpriced. Nobody's dodging drug deals in a theater balcony to get there anymore. The physical grime of the era matched the reputation almost perfectly. Theater floors in the Deuce's porn houses were notoriously sticky enough to become a running joke among New Yorkers who lived through it, and the surrounding blocks were littered with drug paraphernalia and discarded pornography well into the daylight hours. New zoning laws eventually passed in the 1990s, specifically barred adult businesses from operating within 500 feet of a school, church, or another adult business. A legal maneuver precise enough to effectively wipe out the concentrated sex industry that had defined 42nd Street for the better part of 3 decades. Longtime residents remained split on whether the trade-off, glowing billboards and chain restaurants in exchange for genuine grit and affordability, was actually worth it. Number 9. Downtown Las Vegas. Before the modern strip existed in anything like its current form, downtown Las Vegas's Fremont Street, nicknamed Glitter Gulch for its dense cluster of neon signs, was the actual center of Las Vegas gambling. As late as the 1980s, roughly 80% of visitors to Las Vegas made at least one trip downtown to see it. That didn't last. As the strip exploded through the late 1980s and early 1990s, fueled by mega resorts like the Mirage, downtown Las Vegas increasingly became an afterthought. And by 1990 and 1991, that 80% figure had flipped, with less than 20% of visitors still bothering to make the trip. The area grew visibly rougher along the way, losing its family-friendly polish as crowds thinned and the businesses that remained skewed increasingly toward cheaper, seedier operations catering to a shrinking, less affluent client base. City officials eventually spent roughly $70 million building the covered, pedestrian-only Fremont Street experience, which opened in December of 1995. Essentially rebranding downtown Las Vegas from scratch, rather than trying to clean up what remained of the old Glitter Gulch. Adding insult to injury, the growth of locals-only casinos scattered throughout the greater Las Vegas Valley starting in the late 1970s siphoned off a huge share of downtown's regular local clientele too. The residents who used to eat, drink, and gamble at Fremont Street casinos simply because it was close to home. Once locals had closer, newer options, downtown lost both the tourist crowd chasing the strip's new mega resorts and the neighborhood regulars who'd kept the older casinos afloat during leaner years, leaving Fremont Street squeezed from both directions at once. Former Las Vegas Mayor Jan Jones Blackhurst later described the shift bluntly, framing the entire Fremont Street Experience project as an attempt to physically rebuild an identity that downtown had, by the early 1990s, almost entirely lost. Number 8. South Beach, Miami. Before Ocean Drive became a pastel-colored postcard destination, South Beach spent a solid 2 decades as one of Miami's more depressing corners. By the 1970s, the neighborhood had, in the words of one regional travel guide, an unwelcoming reputation for drug-related crime, with once grand hotels sitting mostly vacant and elderly residents keeping largely indoors after dark, out of genuine fear. A Miami Herald retrospective described the area bluntly. Crime kept residents inside at night. A popular outdoor mall had been reduced to a desolate strip where bums slept, and the whole district felt, in the words of one local restaurateur who opened up shop there in 1988, like pioneer country. Historic preservationists finally got the Art Deco district added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1979, which protected the neighborhood's aging hotels from demolition long enough for artists, fashion photographers, and eventually the television series Miami Vice to rediscover the area through the mid-1980s. The transformation from crime-ridden and half-abandoned to internationally trendy took the better part of a decade, and it very much did not happen on its own. The broader backdrop made the neighborhood's decline even messier. South Florida in the early 1980s was ground zero for the American cocaine trade, and the resulting wave of drug-related violence gave the entire Miami metro area, South Beach included, a reputation so chaotic that contemporary reporters routinely compared it to the Wild West. Real, sustained investment in South Beach didn't arrive until preservationists, then designers, then nightlife entrepreneurs slowly proved the neighborhood's crumbling Art Deco hotels were worth saving rather than bulldozing. It's a rare entry on this list where the eventual cleanup succeeded so completely that most visitors today have no idea the glittering Ocean Drive strip was, within living memory, a place longtime residents actively avoided walking through after dark. Even now, decades later, city officials periodically reintroduce curfews and alcohol restrictions along Ocean Drive during peak spring break weeks, a small but telling reminder that the neighborhood's underlying tension between glamour and chaos never fully disappeared. It just learned to keep better hours. Number 7. Atlantic City Boardwalk, New Jersey. Atlantic City's boardwalk, built in 1870 to keep beach sand out of hotel lobbies, spent decades as one of the country's premier vacation destinations before falling into a decline steep enough that even the state eventually had to step in. Following a wave of casino closures in the 2000s, including the $2.4 billion Revel Casino, which lasted barely 2 years before shutting down in 2014, New Jersey took direct control of the city's finances in 2016 just to stabilize things. What's left today draws mixed reviews at best. One travel writer described the modern boardwalk as a major letdown, citing casinos that feel dated and surroundings that read as dirty and lackluster rather than dazzling. The gap between Atlantic City's 1980s heyday, when Mike Tyson fought there and Miss America crowned her winners on the boardwalk, and its current, considerably shabbier reality, is exactly the kind of decline that earns a spot on a list like this one. The boardwalk's still there, so is a fair amount of the grime that came with its long slide downhill. Atlantic City's troubles compound in ways that go beyond simple neglect. Once billed as America's playground, the city's near-total dependence on a single industry, casino gambling, left it especially exposed once neighboring states started legalizing their own casinos and chipping away at what had once been an East Coast monopoly. Boarded-up storefronts now sit within a short walk of the boardwalk's still operating casinos, an uncomfortable visual contrast for anyone expecting the polished, self-contained resort experience marketed in Atlantic City's advertising. State officials taking direct control of the city's finances in 2016 was less a fresh start than an admission that the underlying rot, both financial and literal, had gotten bad enough to require outside intervention just to keep basic services running. Number 6. Galveston Beach, Texas. Galveston has spent years fighting a losing battle against its own water. Sediment carried down from the Mississippi, Trinity, and several other rivers empties into the Gulf right around the island, giving the surf a permanent brownish-gray tint that's less dirty in the traditional sense, and considerably more, unfortunately, geological. That distinction hasn't stopped generations of Texans from joking about it anyway. A marketing firm hired by Galveston's own tourism board eventually confirmed the reputation wasn't just internet noise. Interviews with both residents and visitors repeatedly surfaced phrases like dirty beaches and an overall unclean feel, according to the firm's own findings. Litter and empty cans left behind on the sand compound the problem, and water quality monitoring has periodically flagged elevated fecal bacteria levels at several popular stretches of Seawall Boulevard, occasionally pushing swimming advisories into effect. One frustrated visitor summed up a common reaction after a long drive to the coast. The water was visibly brown and disgusting. The tourism board's own recommended fix, at one point, was simply asking people to stop calling the beaches dirty and start calling them colored with history instead. To be fair to Galveston, some of this really is a matter of unfortunate geology rather than genuine neglect. Marine researchers point out that the fine, easily suspended sand along the Gulf Coast naturally clouds the water anytime waves or currents kick up, an effect that has nothing to do with pollution and everything to do with sediment washing down from major river systems hundreds of miles away. But geology only explains so much. Actual bacterial contamination, driven by runoff and periodic sewage overflow issues common to older coastal infrastructure, is a separate and very real problem. one that no amount of clever rebranding about colored history can fully spin away. Number 5. Daytona Beach, Florida. Daytona Beach earned its wild reputation fair and square, particularly after MTV started broadcasting live from its shores in 1986 and turned the town into shorthand for drunken, chaotic spring break excess for the better part of 2 decades. Long after MTV packed up and left, that reputation, and the actual mess that came with it, stuck around. Beach driving, a genuine local tradition, left the sand streaked with oil stains for years, and cigarette butts, fishing line, and general litter became persistent enough issues that the city eventually built anti-litter messaging directly into its official beach guidelines. The partying itself never fully disappeared either. As recently as this year, Volusia County's sheriff reported more than 75 beachside arrests during a single spring break weekend, including a dozen felony arrests, after videos of chaotic crowd violence went viral and the city declared a state of emergency. Tourism officials have spent years trying to rebrand Daytona as a quiet, affordable family destination. The internet, as one local marketing director put it, doesn't let a keyword like spring break party town go easily. The irony is that Daytona's own tourism board readily admits the physical beach itself is generally clean, well-maintained, and safe for families visiting outside of peak party weeks. It's the reputational residue, decades of viral spring break footage, MTV specials, and now social media clips that keeps outpacing the actual cleanup efforts happening on the ground. Families who visited in the off-season consistently report clean sand and manageable crowds, a stark contrast to the chaos that still, periodically, resurfaces every March when a new wave of college students shows up looking to recreate scenes from decades-old television specials they've only ever seen clips of online. Number 4. Panama City Beach, Florida. For years, Panama City Beach billed itself as one of the biggest spring break destinations in the country, and by 2015, that reputation had curdled into something considerably darker. A house party that spring dissolved into gunfire, injuring 7 people, and a separate videotaped sexual assault on the beach behind a nightclub made national headlines within days of each other, forcing city officials to fundamentally rethink what kind of tourists they actually wanted showing up. The response was swift. The city banned alcohol on the beach throughout March, closed bars at 2 a.m., and restricted parking and scooter rentals, and word of the crackdown spread fast enough online that the hashtag RIPPCB started trending during the following year's spring break season. Some local bar owners reported business drops as steep as 60% almost overnight. Litter enforcement tightened up considerably too, with local crews now actively patrolling the sand to find anyone caught leaving trash behind. It worked, mostly, though recent reporting suggests the rowdier crowds have started drifting back in more recent years, testing just how permanent that 2015 wake-up call actually was. City data from more recent spring breaks paints a fairly sobering picture of just how much strain the annual influx still puts on the area. One recent season alone generated more than 8,000 calls for police service, according to the city's own figures, prompting officials to designate entire high-impact zones with beefed-up enforcement and overnight beach closures running from March through the end of April. The pattern that emerges is one of a destination locked into a cycle. Crack down hard enough to scare the worst behavior away for a season or two. Watch the crowds and the mess creep back once memories fade, then crack down all over again. It's not exactly a permanent fix, but it's been the closest thing Panama City Beach has found to one. Number 3. Bourbon Street, New Orleans. Bourbon Street runs about 7 blocks through the French Quarter, and across thousands of online reviews, the same handful of words keep showing up. Overcrowded, filthy, and reeking. One visitor described the smell bluntly as a mix of stale alcohol and vomit. Another called the whole stretch, after a single nighttime walk, dirty, loud, smelly, and, at times, visually vulgar. The mess isn't incidental to the street's identity, it's built into it. Decades of nightly bar crawls, hurricane cocktails served in oversized cups, and a business model built almost entirely around getting as many tourists as possible, as drunk as possible, have left the pavement stained and the sidewalks routinely blocked by people who didn't quite make it to a bathroom. Multiple visitors, according to travel reviews, have specifically recommended nearby Frenchman Street instead, describing it as the version of a New Orleans night out that actual locals choose for themselves. Bourbon Street's reputation as a rowdy, tolerated mess traces all the way back to Prohibition-era speakeasies. It's simply modernized since then, without ever bothering to clean up along the way. City sanitation crews do run cleanup operations along Bourbon Street every single morning, hosing down the pavement before the next round of tourists arrives, which tells you something about the sheer scale of what accumulates there nightly. Daiquiri shops, selling drinks in cups the size of small buckets, keep the crowds well past midnight, lubricated enough that basic decorum tends to slip considerably. And the open container laws that make Bourbon Street's drink-in-the-street culture possible in the first place are the exact same laws that guarantee there's rarely anywhere appropriate to actually dispose of that cup once it's empty. Locals who still frequent the French Quarter for its food and music tend to treat Bourbon Street itself less as a destination and more as a stretch of sidewalk to be crossed as quickly as possible on the way to somewhere better, a strange fate for a street that remains, on paper, one of the most photographed and visited in the entire country. Number 2, Venice Beach Boardwalk, California. Coming in at number 2 is a boardwalk that, according to its own dedicated social media accounts documenting the decline in real time, has fallen further and faster than almost anywhere else on this list. Venice Beach was once the freewheeling heart of Southern California beach culture, home to Muscle Beach bodybuilders, street performers, and a genuinely eclectic mix of artists and characters. In recent years, it's become something considerably grimmer. Homeless encampments expanded dramatically along Oceanfront Walk over the past several years, at one point numbering roughly 200 tents in a single stretch near the boardwalk, and crime climbed right alongside them. Local police data showed assaults involving a homeless suspect or victim jumping well over 100% year over year at the peak of the crisis, and viral videos of unprovoked attacks on tourists and longtime performers became disturbingly routine online. A 2023 initiative from Los Angeles' mayor finally cleared several of the largest encampments, and crime in those specific areas reportedly dropped by nearly a quarter in the months that followed. But by early 2026, local reporting still put the number of unhoused individuals in the immediate area in the hundreds, and residents interviewed on camera describe a boardwalk still trying to claw its way back from a level of visible decay that would have been unthinkable to the tourists who flocked there just a couple of decades ago. Business owners bore a lot of the direct cost of the decline. Storefronts that once anchored the boardwalk's eclectic, artsy identity closed one after another as foot traffic dropped and insurance and security costs climbed, with more than one longtime shop owner describing the sensation of watching their entire livelihood get erased within the span of just a year or two. A social media account dedicated specifically to documenting Venice's deterioration in close to real time has drawn hundreds of thousands of followers, a level of public fascination that says as much about how far the neighborhood has fallen as any single statistic could. Whether the recent encampment clearances mark a genuine turning point or just a temporary lull remains, as of this recording, very much an open question. Number 1. Hollywood Walk of Fame, Los Angeles. More than 2,500 star-shaped panels line Hollywood Boulevard, each one supposedly honoring entertainment royalty, and each one, by most current accounts, cracked, stained, or barely legible under a permanent film of grime. A recent travel report tracking negative reviews across major American attractions ranked the Walk of Fame at the very top of the list for the phrase "run down," with visitors describing the sidewalk itself as dirty and neglected rather than glamorous. It wasn't always this way, at least not to this degree. The stars were first installed starting in 1960, back when the surrounding boulevard still carried some of the polish of old Hollywood. Decades of foot traffic, souvenir shops selling the same shirts on repeat, and costumed street performers hustling tourists for tips wore the shine off considerably. One recent travel piece described the reality as a neglected sidewalk with faded celebrity names, a description that lands about as far from red carpet glamour as you can get. The stars are still there, technically. So is most of the actual dirt sitting on top of them. The decline runs deeper than just cosmetic grime, too. Vacant storefronts have crept in alongside the souvenir shops in recent years, a symptom of the same commercial exhaustion that's hit plenty of other overexposed tourist corridors across the country. Costumed characters working the sidewalk for tips, ranging from generic superheroes to increasingly aggressive knockoff versions of copyrighted characters, have drawn repeated complaints and occasional police intervention over the years for harassing tourists who declined to pay. What was originally conceived as a glamorous, permanent tribute to entertainment's biggest names has, in practice, become a cautionary tale about what happens when a tourist attraction runs almost entirely on reputation instead of ongoing maintenance. And it's fitting, in a strange way, that the most iconic sidewalk in the country closes out this list. Why these places fell. Look across all 12 entries, and the pattern isn't complicated. Every one of these places got dirty, or dangerous, or both, and every one of them paid for it in lost visitors, lost revenue, or a reputation that outlasted whatever cleanup eventually followed. Some, like Times Square and South Beach, got scrubbed clean enough to become almost unrecognizable versions of their former selves. Others, like Bourbon Street and Fisherman's Wharf, just kept doing exactly what made them filthy in the first place, decade after decade, seemingly without consequence, or at least without consequence severe enough to actually force a change. There's also a pretty clear split in this list between places that got dirty because nobody was paying attention, and places that got dirty because the entire business model depended on nobody paying too much attention. Coney Island, Times Square in its Deuce era, and South Beach all declined largely through neglect, disinvestment, redlining, and shifting economic tides that nobody at the top particularly wanted to address until the damage became impossible to ignore. Bourbon Street, Daytona Beach, and Panama City Beach, on the other hand, stayed messy because mess was, in a very real sense, the product being sold. Nobody profits from a clean, quiet Bourbon Street at 2 in the morning. Somebody profits considerably from exactly the opposite. None of these downfalls happened by accident, and none of them happened overnight either. It took years of neglect, or crime, or a business model that simply didn't care how the place looked the morning after to earn the reputations these 12 locations now carry. Some have genuinely turned things around, spending real money and real political capital to become something their old selves would barely recognize. Others are still very much a work in progress, if they're working on it at all, and a few, if the last several years of reporting are any indication, might be sliding backward again just as quickly as they climbed out the first time. Postcards rarely tell you which version of a place you're actually going to find when you get there. If you enjoyed this look at America's grimiest tourist destinations, give this video a like and subscribe for more honest looks at the places behind the postcards.